Hi, my name's Alex Kershaw. It's great to be with you. Actually, I'm speaking to you right now on the 14th of August. It's the 75th anniversary today, right now as I speak, in fact, in a few hours' time, of the declaration by President Truman in the White House that the Japanese had finally surrendered. That's after the loss of more than 100,000 American lives in the Pacific War. So an historic day today, the 14th of August, 1945. Tomorrow in America was celebrated as VJ Day, but as I speak right now, crowds are starting to form this evening in New York, and those really amazing photographs of huge crowds celebrating the end of the most destructive conflict in world history, World War II, they formed this evening, and America basically started to celebrate perhaps its finest hour, you could say, the end of World War II. Over 60 million people have died in that global conflict. And I want to talk to you about one small chapter, a fantastic chapter, if you ask me, of that war in the Pacific in particular. And I want to tell you quickly the story of the USS Tang. That's the most decorated, the most lethal, most amazing, without a doubt, submarine of the Pacific conflict. The Tang performed 5 spectacular war patrols, and in October of 1944, it was on its 5th patrol, its last patrol, and having fired 24 torpedoes, on the 23rd and 24th of October, I should add, 1944, on the final patrol, the actions on those 2 days earned the captain of the USS Tang the Medal of Honor. Captain Dick O'Kane received the Medal of Honor for the actions he and his submarine fellow submariners, I should say, performed on the 23rd and 24th of October. But anyway, they fired their final torpedo, and they were below decks. They were high-fiving. This was the end of the war as far as they were concerned. They had no more torpedoes left. That meant they had to go back to the barn, as they called it, back to San Francisco, and it would be very unlikely that any of the 87 crew would see combat again. It was late in the war. The U.S. Submarine fleet had performed magnificently, in fact was strangling very effectively the Japanese Empire. Let's not forget that 1 in 4 American submariners came home. That's 3 out of 4 guys were killed during the submarine conflict in the Pacific. And they fired their last torpedo. Only one guy today is alive from the USS Tang. That's a guy called Bill Liebold. I spoke to him a couple of months ago. He's now 97 years old, and he was on the bridge of the USS Tang, looking through his binoculars. He had fantastic eyesight, and it was after dark, and he saw the 23rd torpedo being fired, and then he saw the very last torpedo. And as he looked through his binoculars, he told me he could see the last torpedo start to porpoise. And he knew that there was something wrong there, that shouldn't be happening. And so he looked through his binoculars, and he followed the torpedo, which was set for around 47 seconds. That the journey of the torpedo would be 47 seconds from the Tang and to the ship where it would explode. And he saw the torpedo start to porpoise, and then there was a sort of phosphorescent wake behind the torpedo, and then it started to turn. And tragically, he watched as this final torpedo on the final patrol of the Tang actually boomeranged. It came back and actually sank the Tang. 78 guys were lost, and there were just 9 survivors. Most of the survivors were thrown from the Tang when the torpedo exploded and hit the Tang with immense force. The Tang went down to 180 feet. It sank down to 180 feet. And then for the first and only time in US history, guys managed to escape from a sunken submarine. There have been other cases where Americans have been saved from disasters, saved but with surface assistance. But this is the only time in history, the USS Tang in October 1944, the only time in history that any Americans have ever escaped from a sunken submarine under their own efforts without any help from the surface. And it was an absolutely astonishing achievement. They had to climb up a rope for about 180 feet, and every 10 feet there was a knot in the rope, and they had to pause for several seconds so that the pressure in their lungs could equalize and they didn't die of the bends. So in pitch blackness, being depth charged by the Japanese, having almost run out of air, in indescribable conditions within the Tang, air running out, fires blazing, having got through that ordeal, they then had to find their way steadily up a rope, and amazingly 5 guys managed to do that, becoming the first Americans to ever get out of a sunken sub without help. All 9 of the survivors from the Tang were picked up by the Japanese several hours later. They were tortured pretty badly, sent to 2 prisoner war camps, and on the 14th of August, today, 75 years ago, they were working in a POW camp called Ofuna, just across from Tokyo Bay, and they heard the words in Japanese from the Japanese Emperor Hirohito announcing that Japan was going to surrender. Obviously, they looked around and they saw the guards that were with them, and they could tell by the expressions on the guards' faces that this great ordeal was finally over. They were liberated from Ofuna a couple of weeks later, and then most of the survivors, the 9 survivors, got back to the United States in September of 1945. So the Tang is an extraordinary story. It was a real story of survival and determination and courage. We often forget about the silent service. That's what the submariners were called. They did an amazing job. They contributed greatly to Allied victory in the Pacific in World War II, and they gave their lives in great numbers. It was a great sacrifice. I think the submarine service was the most fatal service that you could join. In the Pacific anyway. The 8th Air Force obviously in Europe suffered very high casualties too. So only 1 guy alive today from those amazing survivors. It was a miracle that they got out of the Tang. It was a miracle that they were picked up by the Japanese and survived captivity in those last desperate months of World War II. And we have 1 guy in California today, 97-year-old Bill Liebold. I'd like to say hello to him and ask you all to remember that there's only just 1 guy from that amazing submarine alive, and that there are very, very few, less than 2% of the so-called greatest generation are still with us today to celebrate the end of that terrible global conflict, World War II. So thanks for listening, and have a wonderful celebration of the end of that war, which was hard-earned. Thank you.